Welcome to Dusk and Empires. Tonight, we uncover the tender, aching letters John and Abigail Adams wrote to each other across 7 years of wartime separation, a love story so intimate, so quietly radical, history almost forgot to tell it. If this sounds like your kind of bedtime story, subscribe before you drift off. Now get comfortable, close your eyes, and let history carry you to sleep. Opening meditation. Close your eyes, if you haven't already. Let the weight of the day settle down through you, through your shoulders, through your hands, through the soles of your feet. Tonight, we are going somewhere quiet. Somewhere lit by candlelight and ink-stained with longing. We are going to a time when two people, separated by the vast and uncertain distances of a new nation being born, wrote each other letters that somehow survived everything. The wars. The politics. The grief. The years. Let your breathing slow. There is nowhere you need to be. Nothing that needs deciding. Part 1, The Farm at the Edge of the World. This is Braintree. Later it will be called Quincy. But in the 1760s and 1770s, it is simply home. It is the place where John Adams was born and where, not far along the same road, Abigail Smith grew up in her father's parsonage. It is the place they both returned to again and again across the long decades of a life shared across extraordinary distances. John Adams was born here in 1735, the son of a farmer and a selectman, a man named John Adams the Elder who plowed his own fields and believed with the sturdy certainty of New England Puritanism that hard work and education were the twin pillars on which a decent life was built. The younger John would inherit both of those beliefs and carry them forward into a world his father could barely have imagined. He graduated from Harvard in 1755 at the age of 20. He studied law. He read Cicero and Thucydides in the evenings by firelight, annotating the margins with his own thoughts in a handwriting that was dense and slightly slanted to the right, as if the words were leaning into a wind only he could feel. He was, from the beginning, a man who processed the world through language. He thought by writing. He understood himself by writing. And the great good fortune of his life was that he would find, early and permanently, someone who understood the world in exactly the same way. Abigail Smith was born in 1744, 9 years younger than John. She grew up in Weymouth, a few miles from Braintree, in the household of the Reverend William Smith, a Congregationalist minister who believed, unusually for his time, that daughters deserved as much intellectual nourishment as sons. Abigail did not attend formal school, as girls of her era rarely did, but she read everything her father's extensive library offered. She read Shakespeare and John Locke and Pope and Richardson. She read history and theology and the occasional novel that circulated among the young women of the parish with the careful secrecy of something delicious and slightly transgressive. She was, by every account, a remarkable person. Sharp and quick and deeply serious, with a warmth that made the seriousness feel not austere but alive. She had what one family friend described as a quality of attention, the sense that when she listened to you, she was truly listening, weighing what you said against everything she knew and everything she believed, and that her response, when it came, would be both honest and kind. John Adams first met Abigail Smith when she was about 14 and he was 23. He was visiting her family home with a mutual friend, a man named Richard Cranch who would later marry Abigail's older sister Mary. On that first visit, John found the Smith girls amusing but not particularly noteworthy. He wrote in his diary that he found them neither fond, nor frank, nor candid. He was a young man who was not yet capable of seeing clearly what was right in front of him. they began to write each other letters. This is where everything truly begins. Not in the parlor at Weymouth, not in the arguments over Locke and the rights of colonists, not even in the formal courtship that followed. It begins with letters. It begins with that act of reaching across distance with nothing but words in the hope that the person on the other end will receive them as they were intended. Their early letters are playful, almost deliberately light, as if neither of them is quite ready to admit the full weight of what they feel. They addressed each other with literary pseudonyms, a fashionable affectation of the period. John called Abigail Diana, after the Roman goddess of the moon. Abigail called John Lysander, after the Spartan general, which tells you something about both her classical education and her quiet sense of humor, since Lysander was known as much for his cunning as his courage. In one early letter, John wrote with mock seriousness about Abigail's supposed faults, a list that included her habit of crossing her legs when she sat, and her tendency to read with her head bent too low over the page. It was the kind of letter a man writes when he is desperately in love and not yet quite able to say so directly, so he says it sideways, through teasing, through invented criticism that is really just close observation wearing a costume. Abigail's response was perfect. She turned the teasing back on him with complete poise, acknowledging the supposed faults with serene good humor and suggesting that if he found them so troubling, perhaps he should look elsewhere for companionship. It was a reply that was simultaneously warm and deflecting and privately an invitation to try harder. He tried harder. By 1764, John Adams was 30 years old and had established himself as a promising young lawyer in Braintree. Abigail was 20. They had been corresponding for several years, and the letters had long since outgrown their early playfulness and become something more sustained, more searching. They talked about law and philosophy. They talked about the growing tensions between the colonies in Britain. They talked about what it meant to live a life of purpose in a world that seemed to be changing faster than anyone could fully comprehend. And on October 25, 1764, they married. The ceremony was performed by Abigail's father, the Reverend William Smith, in the parlor of the Weymouth parsonage. It was a modest affair, as most Puritan weddings were. No great feast, no elaborate display. Just two people making a promise in a room that smelled of old wood and candle wax and the particular quietness of an October afternoon in New England, when the leaves have already turned and the world is settling into the long thoughtfulness of autumn. They moved into the small farmhouse in Braintree that would anchor the rest of their lives. And for a brief and ordinary time, they were simply a young couple trying to build something together. John practiced law. Abigail managed the household with the competence and intelligence she brought to everything. They had their first child, a daughter they named Abigail, who would always be called Nabby. And then a son. And then another son. Life accumulated around them in the way it does when the world is not yet demanding extraordinary things. But the world was about to begin demanding extraordinary things. Part 2: The World Breaking Open. There is a particular smell to a printing house in the 18th century. It is a compound of ink and paper and the slightly acrid warmth of the press itself, the wooden and iron mechanism that turns words into objects that can be held and passed from hand to hand across a city, a colony, a continent. In the years leading up to the Revolution, the printing houses of Boston worked without ceasing, turning out pamphlets and broadsides and newspapers that carried, in their dense columns of type, the raw material of a revolution in the making. John Adams walked those streets. He knew the printing houses and the coffee houses and the wharves, the whole geography of a city that was slowly, then rapidly, being transformed by political crisis into something no one had quite experienced before. He was part of it. He was arguing cases in the courts of a colony that felt increasingly like occupied territory. He was reading Locke and thinking about rights and writing in his diary with mounting urgency about what he believed and why. The Stamp Act of 1765 was, in many ways, the beginning of the end. It was the British Parliament's decision to impose direct taxes on the American colonies, on every legal document, every newspaper, every pamphlet, every playing card. It was presented as a reasonable measure to help defray the costs of the 7 Years' War, which had been fought partly on American soil and partly on American behalf. It was received in the colonies as an assault on the fundamental principle that Englishmen could only be taxed with their consent, through their own representatives. John Adams wrote a response to the Stamp Act that was published in the Boston Gazette and later reprinted in London. It was a carefully argued, deeply learned document that drew on natural law and English legal precedent and the philosophical tradition going back to Magna Carta. It was the work of a man who had been preparing for this argument his entire adult life without quite knowing it. It announced him as a serious thinker in the public arena and began the long process by which John Adams became, slowly and somewhat reluctantly, a revolutionary. Abigail followed all of it from Braintree. She read the pamphlets. She talked to neighbors and travelers. She wrote to her family and friends with the same analytical precision her husband brought to his legal briefs. She was not a spectator. She was never, not for a single moment of her adult life, a spectator. She was a participant in the intellectual life of the revolution as fully as her circumstances permitted, which was more fully than most women of her time because most women did not have John Adams coming home in the evenings and talking through everything he had argued and read and thought. But even as the political crisis deepened, the private life of the Adams household was deepening too. More children came. Susanna, who lived only a year and whose loss left a quiet grief in the correspondence for months afterward. Charles. Thomas. The farm needed constant attention. The law practice needed to be managed, clients seen, cases prepared. Money was always a concern, never desperate but always real. John's absences grew longer as the political situation drew him more and more toward Boston, toward the centers of colonial resistance, away from the saltbox house with the apple trees and the smell of the sea. And so the letters multiplied. When John was in Boston and Abigail in Braintree, they wrote constantly. The letters were practical, but they were also something more. They were the continuation of a conversation that had been going on since they were teenagers, a conversation about ideas and politics and children and money and the texture of daily life, but also about something harder to name, the ongoing project of knowing each other deeply, of staying close across the distances that life kept imposing. There is a letter from these years in which John describes riding home from Boston on a winter evening, the road hard with frost, the sky above him full of more stars than the city ever permitted him to see. He writes about it to Abigail with the kind of specificity that suggests he was composing the letter in his head as he rode, holding the image carefully against the moment when he could put it down on paper and send it to her. He tells her what the stars looked like. He tells her how cold the air was against his face. He tells her that he thought of her. These are not the letters of a man who regards correspondence as a duty. They are the letters of someone for whom writing to this particular person is as necessary as breathing, an ongoing act of intimacy performed across distance because it is the only intimacy available. Abigail's letters back were their equal. She wrote with clarity and vividness about the farm, about the children, about the news that came through Braintree by rumor and newspaper and the accounts of neighbors who had been to Boston. She wrote about her fears. She wrote about her loneliness. And she wrote, with increasing frequency and increasing passion, about the political situation, about what she believed and why, about what she thought justice demanded. In 1770, Boston erupted. On the night of March 5, in a street made slick with snow and tension, British soldiers fired into a crowd of colonists. 5 men died. The event was immediately called a massacre by those who wanted to use it, and the word spread through the colonies with the speed of a story that carries its own emotional logic regardless of the specific facts. Paul Revere engraved an image of the scene that simplified it into pure narrative, redcoats firing on helpless civilians, and it was reproduced and distributed until the image was as widely known as anything in American visual culture. John Adams was asked to defend the British soldiers. He wrote about why. He believed that the rule of law was not separable from the cause of liberty. That if the colonies were going to claim the rights of Englishmen, they had to honor the principles that underlay those rights, including the principle that even those accused of terrible things deserved a fair trial and competent defense. He was right. He knew it. And he accepted the social cost of it with a quiet, gritting courage that is easy to underestimate because it was so private. He argued the case brilliantly. He secured acquittals for most of the soldiers and reduced sentences for the rest. And then he came home to Braintree and wrote to Abigail about what it had cost him. Not the political cost, the loss of clients, the cold shoulders in the streets of Boston. But the interior cost, the exhaustion of defending what you believe against what you feel, the loneliness of being right in a way no one wants to acknowledge. Abigail understood. She always understood. Her reply, careful and warm and characteristically exact, told him that she was proud of him, that she believed what he had done was necessary, and that the judgment of history would be kinder to him than the judgment of the moment. She was right on all counts. The year 1770 also brought another death into their household. The infant Susanna had already been lost. Now a second daughter, born the previous year and named after her mother, died before she reached her first birthday. These losses are present in the letters, not dramatically, not with the kind of explicit grief that modern readers sometimes expect, but in the particular way that 18th-century people absorbed grief, through scripture and resignation and a belief that sorrow was one of the conditions of being alive rather than an exception to it. And yet the tenderness between John and Abigail in the letters written across these losses is unmistakable. They were holding each other up across the miles. The world was continuing to break open. The Tea Act. The Boston Tea Party of 1773, that extraordinary night when colonists disguised as Mohawk warriors dumped 342 chests of East India Company tea into Boston Harbor. John Adams wrote in his diary that it was the grandest event which has ever yet happened since the controversy with Britain opened. He was astonished by it. He was thrilled by it. And he was also, characteristically, worried about what it meant. Because he understood, better than most, that you cannot pour tea into a harbor without consequences. The question was what kind of consequences, and whether those consequences could be managed in a way that led somewhere better rather than simply somewhere worse. Part 3, The First Congress and the First Long Separation. The summer of 1774 had a weight to it that people who lived through it could feel in their bodies. He left in August. Abigail saw him off. We do not have a record of that particular goodbye. We do not know exactly what they said to each other in the doorway of the farmhouse at Braintree, or whether the children were present, or what the weather was like that morning. But we have the letters that began almost immediately afterward, and those letters carry within them the emotional register of that departure, the mixture of pride and fear and longing and the peculiarly physical sensation of absence that begins the moment a person you love walks out of sight. Abigail wrote first, as she almost always did when they were separated. She wrote about the farm and the children and the news from Boston. She wrote about her fears for him, carefully calibrated fears, not panic but honest concern from someone who understood exactly what was at stake. She asked him to write often. She told him she missed him with a restraint that somehow made the missing more palpable than dramatics would have. He described the other delegates. He was professionally cautious in his assessments, since letters could be intercepted and read, but his descriptions are nevertheless full of careful observation. He admired George Washington, noting his imposing physical presence and what he called an easy, soldier-like air. He was fascinated by Patrick Henry, whose oratory he found brilliant but perhaps not backed by the kind of sustained analytical thinking that Adams himself brought to the work. He was more guarded about others. He was always most honest with Abigail. The First Continental Congress met through September and October of 1774. It produced a declaration of rights and grievances, a formal statement of what the colonies believed Parliament had violated. It organized a Continental Association, a coordinated economic boycott of British goods. It agreed to meet again in May 1775 if the situation had not improved. And then the delegates went home. April 19, 1775. Lexington and Concord. Abigail was at home in Braintree when the shots were fired. The news reached her almost immediately, carried by writers and the particular speed with which catastrophic news travels through communities where everyone is already afraid. She wrote to John in Philadelphia, where the Second Continental Congress was already in session, with a vividness and immediacy that makes the letter feel as present as something written this morning. She told him that the road outside their house was full of troops moving toward Lexington. That the night before the battle, she had heard drums and the sound of men marching in the darkness. She wrote about the fear she felt, and about the determination she also felt, and about the children, and about the farm, and about the spring, which had come on with its usual indifferent beauty while the world remade itself around it. The letter is one of the most extraordinary documents of the entire Revolutionary period. It is not a political document. It is a human one. It is the letter of a woman who is frightened and brave and alone and in the middle of a war that is happening in her front yard, writing to the man she loves because writing to him is how she keeps herself together. John received it in Philadelphia and replied with the particular anguish of a man who is exactly where history requires him to be and exactly where he does not want to be at the same time. He was supposed to be home. He was supposed to be with her. Instead, he was sitting in the Pennsylvania State House, trying to help negotiate the response of a continent to the fact that the first shots of a revolution had been fired. He wrote to her about his state of mind with unusual directness. He confessed his anxiety. He confessed his longing. And he told her something that would become one of the quiet foundations of their entire correspondence, that she was the only person to whom he could tell the truth about what he felt, because she was the only person who could receive that truth without being frightened by it or using it against him. That is a remarkable thing to say. And it is even more remarkable when you understand the political environment of 1775, when positions had to be managed and appearances maintained, and the wrong word in the wrong letter could destroy a man's reputation. John Adams trusted Abigail with the whole of himself, the fear as well as the courage, the doubt as well as the conviction. And that trust was the deepest thing in their relationship. Part 4, Remember the Ladies. The siege of Boston was underway. British troops were essentially trapped within the city, blockaded by the Continental Army that had gathered with remarkable speed from across New England. Farmers and tradesmen and young men who had never fired a musket in anger suddenly finding themselves soldiers in a war that no one had quite planned for. Abigail could hear the cannon fire from Braintree. She wrote about it to John with that characteristic precision of someone who was reporting facts, because naming facts is a way of managing the fear behind them. She wrote about climbing Penn's Hill with her son John Quincy, who was 7 years old that summer, to watch the Battle of Bunker Hill through the smoke and distance. She held her child's hand and watched men die, and then went home and wrote her husband a letter that described what she had seen with the steady, clear-eyed sadness of someone who has decided that honesty is the only gift she can give in a situation where so much else is beyond her control. John Quincy Adams was 7 years old when he stood on that hill with his mother and watched a battle that would shape his understanding of history for the rest of his long life. He would later say that the image of his mother's face at that moment, the composed and grief-stricken and dignified face of a woman watching a war from a hilltop, was one of the formative images of his existence. Abigail was managing everything that summer and fall and into the following winter. The farm, the children, the finances, the constant threat of British troops, smallpox, the practical daily emergencies of a household running without its head during a time of general emergency. She was doing this while also being, functionally, John's political secretary, confidential correspondent, and intellectual companion. She was reading the newspapers and sending him digests. She was talking to people in Braintree and the surrounding towns and telling him what the mood was, what people feared and hoped and suspected. And she was developing her own political views with increasing confidence and increasing radicalism. It was in March of 1776 that she wrote the letter for which she is perhaps most remembered, the letter in which she asked John and the Congress to remember the ladies. She wrote it in the context of the discussions then beginning about what kind of legal and political framework the new nation would have if independence was actually achieved. She had been thinking about it for a long time, with the methodical thoroughness she brought to every serious question. And when she finally wrote, she did not equivocate. Read that sentence again in your mind, if you like. All men would be tyrants if they could. This was written in 1776. By a woman who had no legal standing of her own, who could own no property, who could vote in no election, who had been educated entirely through her own determination and her father's unusual liberality, who was living alone on a farm in a time of war, managing everything, and who still found the clarity and the courage to write those words to the most powerful political body in the colonies and tell them plainly what justice required. John's reply is famous and also honest and also somewhat exasperating. He wrote back with fond amusement, calling her saucy and telling her that the notion that men were already dominated by the women in their lives was well known, and that even as he said this, he clearly could not quite take the request as seriously as it deserved. He replied to her argument with affection rather than engagement, which is perhaps the most common way that serious arguments by women were deflected in that period and in many periods since. Abigail was not deterred. She wrote back and said that, since men were so arbitrary, perhaps the ladies would need to find their power through other means. She was not angry, exactly. She was patient in the way that someone is patient when they understand that the world is not ready for what they know to be true, and they are willing to wait, but they are not willing to pretend the truth is different from what it is. This exchange is not a minor footnote in their correspondence. It is one of its central documents. It reveals something important about both of them, about John's limitations and his genuine love for the woman who challenged him, about Abigail's conviction and her refusal to soften her beliefs even when addressing the man she loved most in the world. They disagreed, honestly, without it damaging what was between them. That, too, is remarkable. The spring of 1776 was the spring in which everything became inevitable. Thomas Paine's common sense was circulating through the colonies with the force of a document that says what everyone has been thinking but no one has said clearly before. The idea of independence, which had seemed radical even 6 months earlier, was rapidly becoming the only coherent position. John Adams was at the center of it. He was on more committees than any other delegate. He was arguing, persuading, drafting, negotiating. He was running, by his own account, on almost no sleep, eating irregularly, wearing himself down to something that frightened him when he looked in a mirror. He wrote to Abigail about the exhaustion with the careful honesty that characterized his letters to her, telling her things about his state of mind that he would not tell anyone else because he could not afford to let anyone else see the cracks. She wrote back and told him to rest. She told him to eat. She told him with gentle and utterly pragmatic New England directness that the Republic needed him alive and healthy more than it needed him heroically destroyed. And then she asked him about the Declaration. He told her what he could, which was not much, but which was enough. He told her that something was being prepared. That the summer might bring with it a decision that would change the shape of the world. She read between the lines, as she always did. Part 5, The Summer of Independence. July 1776 was hot in Philadelphia. The Pennsylvania State House, where the delegates of the Continental Congress were gathered, was a fine building with tall windows in good proportions, but in July the heat was oppressive and the windows had to be kept closed against the flies and the smell of the horse stable directly nearby. The delegates sweated in their wool coats and argued and revised and argued again. Thomas Jefferson had been assigned to draft the Declaration itself, and Jefferson, with his extraordinary literary gift, had produced something that transcended the political purpose it was meant to serve and became one of the defining documents of human history. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The Congress edited Jefferson's draft. They removed, most notably, a passage condemning the slave trade, which was too much for the delegates from South Carolina and Georgia. Jefferson was furious. Adams, who had his own complicated relationship with the question of slavery and who would later acknowledge that its presence in the new nation was the thing most likely to destroy it, accepted the compromise as a political necessity without being entirely at peace with it. The contradictions of a revolution fought for liberty by men who held other men in bondage were not invisible to the people living through it. They were present in the room. On July 2, 1776, the Continental Congress voted to declare independence. 12 colonies voted in favor. New York abstained. Pennsylvania and Delaware were divided, but the resolution passed. The United States of America was, at least in the minds of its founders, a nation. John Adams wrote to Abigail on July 3 with a sense of occasion that is extraordinary even for a man who was always aware of historical magnitude. He told her that July 2nd would be the most memorable epoch in the history of America. He told her he believed it would be celebrated by subsequent generations as the great anniversary festival with solemn acts of devotion to God Almighty, with pomp and parade, with shows, games, sports, guns, bells, bonfires, and illuminations from one end of the continent to the other. He was wrong about the date, slightly. The Declaration was formally adopted on the 4th, and it is the 4th that became the holiday. But the vision was accurate in nearly every particular. He then added something that brings us back to the human person behind the historical figure. He told her that he wished she could be there. That he wished the distance between them was not what it was. That the greatness of the moment was real, but that it sat alongside the personal cost of the moment, the separation, the loneliness, the exhaustion, and that both things were true at the same time, and he needed her to know both. Abigail received the letter in Braintree, where she was managing a smallpox crisis that had descended on the town and forced her to bring the family into Boston for inoculation, a procedure that was itself dangerous and deeply frightening, especially for the children. She was doing this alone, making medical decisions for her entire household without her husband present, in a city that was just emerging from British occupation and was still marked by the physical and social disruption of everything it had been through. She wrote back about the smallpox and the children and her fear. And she wrote about the Declaration with the same quality of historical awareness that John had shown. She understood what it meant. She had been thinking about it for years. She was glad. She was frightened. She was proud. And she missed him. The summer of 1776 was, in many ways, the emotional high point of their correspondence, the moment when everything they had believed and worked for arrived as reality, but the reality was also this: they were apart. They were apart when the most important event of their shared lives happened. They heard about it in letters, across distances measured in days of travel, and they celebrated it separately, each of them holding the memory of the other's face while the bells rang and the bonfires lit the sky. There is something in that which speaks to the whole character of their story. This is a love expressed through absence as much as presence. It is a love that learned early to translate everything, the joy and the fear and the daily ordinary texture of life, into language, because language was what could cross the distance. They became, across those long separations, extraordinary letter writers. They became people for whom the act of writing was inseparable from the act of loving. John remained in Philadelphia through the summer and fall of 1776. The war had begun in earnest. Washington's army was fighting in New York with mixed results, and the military situation was far from certain. The Congress had to keep functioning, keep making decisions, keep holding itself together as a governing body, even as the battles raged and the outcome was genuinely uncertain. John was appointed to the Board of War, which essentially made him the civilian supervisor of the American military effort. This meant more work, more committees, more sleepless nights. The letters to Abigail became shorter, less frequent, and more exhausted. She could read the fatigue in his handwriting, she said, before she even read the words. She kept writing anyway. She filled her letters with the details of life at Braintree, with the practical information about the farm and the children and the local situation, but also with the steady, warm, sustaining presence of someone who knows that the person on the other end of the correspondence is running on empty and needs to be reminded that there is something waiting for him on the other side of all of this. Part 6: Diplomacy, Ocean, and the Terrible Year. In February 1778, John Adams boarded a ship called the Boston. He was going to France. The Continental Congress had appointed him as one of 3 commissioners to the French court, alongside Benjamin Franklin and Arthur Lee. France had been cautiously supporting the American cause, providing money and supplies and the occasional volunteer like Lafayette, but formal alliance had not yet been achieved. The Battle of Saratoga in October 1777 had changed the calculation significantly, proving that the Americans could actually defeat British forces in the field. Now the diplomacy needed to follow. John Adams was being sent to Paris to help complete what needed to be done. He took his 10-year-old son John Quincy with him. Abigail did not come. The decision was discussed in letters that are among the most painful in the entire correspondence. She wanted to go. She had been alone on the farm for years, managing everything, carrying the family through smallpox and war and financial uncertainty, and the prospect of being alone again, for an indefinite period, across an ocean, while her husband and her oldest son sailed through winter seas toward a war zone, was almost more than she could bear. But she agreed. She agreed because she understood what he was going to do and why it mattered. She agreed because she believed in the cause as deeply as he did. She agreed because she was Abigail Adams and she did not allow what she wanted to stand in the way of what she believed was right. The crossing was terrible. The Boston encountered British ships and had to fight its way past them. There were storms. The food was bad and the quarters worse. John Adams was seasick and frightened and writing in his diary with the methodical persistence of a man who was determined to record everything because recording things is a way of staying in control when control is otherwise unavailable. He wrote about the Atlantic in language that conveys both its vastness and its indifference, the gray swells rising and falling with a rhythm that had nothing to do with human plans or human urgency. They arrived in France in April 1778. And the world that opened before John Adams was unlike anything his New England soul had prepared him for. Paris was extraordinary. It was the greatest city in the Western world, full of art and music and philosophical sophistication and a culture of elegance that made Philadelphia look provincial and Boston look positively austere. John Adams, who was deeply Puritan in his bones even as he was also deeply intellectual, found it dazzling and slightly alarming. He admired the art. He was fascinated by the conversation. He was suspicious of the luxury and the moral looseness that he thought he detected in French aristocratic culture. And he had to work alongside Benjamin Franklin, which was its own particular challenge. Franklin was 72 years old in 1778, internationally famous, universally beloved in France as the embodiment of the American genius, the backwoods philosopher who had tamed lightning and helped write the Declaration of Independence. The French adored him. They made miniatures of his face. They named streets after him. And Franklin, who understood exactly how useful his celebrity was to the American cause, played the role to perfection, wearing his fur cap and his plain coat, dropping witticisms, charming ministers and duchesses and intellectuals with equal ease. John Adams found this simultaneously impressive and maddening. He thought Franklin worked irregular hours, kept bad company, was insufficiently attentive to the administrative details of their mission, and relied too heavily on social charm where rigorous argument was required. Adams was not entirely wrong. Franklin was not entirely wrong about the way diplomacy actually worked in 18th century Europe. They were both right and they were also, temperamentally, almost perfectly incompatible. Meanwhile, Abigail was in Braintree. Alone. Receiving letters that took months to arrive, some of which never arrived at all because the ships carrying them were captured or sunk. She wrote to John and did not know if he received her letters. She received letters from him with gaps of weeks and months in between. She was managing the farm through a period of severe inflation, the continental currency losing value so rapidly that ordinary commerce became a daily mathematical challenge. She wrote about this with the same clear precision she brought to everything. She was not complaining, exactly. She was reporting. She was keeping him informed. But underneath the reports, the longing was there, the plain and unglamorous loneliness of someone who has been waiting too long and knows they will go on waiting and has made peace with that knowledge without being entirely at peace with it. She wrote, "I have sometimes been ready to think that the passion for liberty cannot be equally strong in the breasts of those who have been accustomed to deprive their fellow creatures of theirs." That sentence is quietly devastating. It comes at the end of a letter that has been discussing the political situation with great precision and intelligence, and then it lands like that, this oblique and painful observation about slavery and hypocrisy, placed in a letter to her husband who was in France arguing for the rights of men. She was not attacking him. She was thinking aloud. But the thought was real and the courage to write it was real, and the woman who wrote it was doing so from a position of her own considerable deprivation, waiting alone on a farm while the men went off to make history. In 1779, John returned home. It was a reunion of tremendous joy. The letters had been keeping them alive to each other, but they were also, inevitably, an incomplete substitute for presence, for the actual physical reality of being in the same room as the person you love. They had 4 months together. And then he was sent back. This time as minister plenipotentiary to negotiate peace terms with Britain when and if the moment came. It was an honor. It was also an indication that the Congress trusted John Adams with the most consequential diplomacy the new nation would require. It was also, for Abigail, the beginning of another long absence that would stretch not into months but years. He took John Quincy again. He took their second son Charles too. And then the ship left Boston Harbor in November 1779. And Abigail stood on the shore and watched it go, and went home and wrote him a letter. Part 7, The Longest Absence. There is a particular quality to waiting that is different from grief, though it contains grief within it. Grief has an object. It has a before and after. It arrives as a blow and then slowly, over time, changes shape, becomes part of you in a different way. Waiting is more like a sustained condition. It is the state of being a person who is simultaneously present and absent, physically here but emotionally always reaching toward somewhere else, toward the person who is not here, toward the letters that are coming or not coming, toward the vague and distant horizon where the ship went. Abigail Adams waited from 1779 to 1784. 5 years. 5 years in which she managed the farm, raised the children, oversaw the finances, watched her second son Charles become homesick enough that he was sent home after a year in Europe, worried about John Quincy in a foreign country, worried about John in Paris and Amsterdam and The Hague and wherever else the diplomacy required him to be, and wrote. Always wrote. The letters from this period are among the most extraordinary in American epistolary history. They have the quality of a sustained dialogue conducted under conditions of extreme deprivation, a dialogue between two people who have learned to put everything into language because everything must be put into language or it will be lost. Abigail wrote about the farm in such detail that you can see it, the fields in autumn, the way the first frost came and whitened the grass before sunrise, the smell of wood smoke from the chimney, the sound of the children at their lessons in the room below while she sat at her desk and composed her letters by the light of a candle that had to be replaced because she wrote into the night. She wrote about her neighbors and the local politics of Braintree and the news from the war, which was still ongoing in the southern colonies even as the northern theater had quieted. She also wrote about loneliness with a directness that is not self-pitying but is unflinching. She wrote, "I consider it as a sacrifice to my happiness, a tax upon my domestic enjoyments, that the public have a right to demand." A tax upon her domestic enjoyments. That precise, slightly ironic phrase says more about her situation than a page of complaint would. She was a patriot. She believed in what her husband was doing. She understood that his work was necessary. And yet she also named clearly what it cost her, because she was constitutionally unable to pretend that costs were not costs simply because they were patriotically incurred. John's letters back were filled with the details of European political life, the intricacies of the peace negotiations, the frustrations of working within a diplomatic corps that was frequently at cross purposes, the sheer complexity of trying to represent the interests of a new and fragile nation in the courts of Europe while having very little in the way of reliable instructions from home. He was, by his own description, often alone in a foreign city with inadequate funds and insufficient staff and a mission whose parameters kept shifting. But he wrote to her about everything. He wrote about what it was like to see Versailles. He wrote about the Dutch tulip markets and the extraordinary paintings in Amsterdam. He wrote about what he was learning about European politics and what that meant for the American future. He was giving her his education, sharing it as it happened, because she was the person he most wanted to share it with. He also wrote, more than once, that he envied the people who could spend their lives in quiet domesticity, who did not have to sacrifice the ordinary daily pleasures of being home for the extraordinary and exhausting business of public service. There is a genuinely poignant quality to these passages, written by a man who was doing the work of history and who has never, not for a single day, stopped preferring the company of one particular woman to the company of courts and congresses and kings. In 1782, the pace of the diplomacy accelerated. The war had effectively ended with the British surrender at Yorktown in October 1781. Now the actual peace had to be negotiated. John Adams, alongside Benjamin Franklin and John Jay, spent months in Paris hammering out the terms of what would become the Treaty of Paris, which was signed on September 3, 1783. The treaty recognized the full independence of the United States, established the borders of the new nation, and concluded the legal state of war with Britain. It was the culmination of everything John Adams had been working toward for the better part of a decade. He had believed in American independence when it was a radical idea. He had argued for it when it required political courage. He had represented it in the courts of Europe when it required diplomatic endurance. And now here was the treaty, the document that made it legally real in the eyes of the world. He wrote to Abigail from Paris the day it was signed. The letter is not triumphant, exactly. It is satisfied. It has the quality of a man who has finally been able to put down a very heavy thing he has been carrying for a very long time. He told her what had been agreed. He told her what he thought it meant for the nation. And then he told her that he hoped, now, that they might be allowed some peace. That perhaps he could come home. But he could not come home yet. The diplomacy was not finished. He was appointed, along with Franklin and Jefferson, to negotiate commercial treaties with the European powers. That would take another year at least. And so the absence continued, and the letters continued, and Abigail continued to wait. She wrote to him, "What a lesson it is to human nature, of the vanity of all human institutions, when the best and the wisest of men are obliged to barter away years of their domestic happiness for the sake of public welfare? Vanity. She used that word deliberately. She was a woman of the Bible and she knew its resonances. All is vanity and vexation of spirit. She was not saying his work was meaningless. She was saying that the cost of it was real and visible and ought to be named, even when it was also worth paying. Part 8, Reunion and London. In the summer of 1784, Abigail Adams finally crossed the Atlantic. She had not been to sea before. She had not, in fact, traveled farther from Braintree than New York in her entire 40 years of life. She packed carefully, with the methodical thoroughness of someone who has been managing a farm for years and knows that preparation is the only antidote to catastrophe. She brought food and linens and medicines. She brought books. She brought their daughter Nabby. And on June 20, 1784, she boarded the Active in Boston Harbor and began the journey to her husband. The crossing took about a month. Abigail was seasick for much of it. She was also observant and curious and recording everything in her letters and diary with that characteristic attention that she brought to all new experience. She wrote about the ocean with the slight bewilderment of someone who has heard it described but has never actually experienced the fact of it, the sheer unbroken expanse of water in all directions, the way the sky meets the sea at a horizon that seems to move with you but never actually comes closer. She arrived in London first, as John was delayed in The Hague. She waited for him in a boarding house in Grosvenor Square, in a London that was both familiar and foreign, a city she had read about all her life that was now around her in its physical reality, smelling of coal smoke and river and the particular dampness of an English summer. John arrived in London on August 7, 1784. They had been separated for 5 years. There is no letter from that reunion because there was no need to write a letter. For the first time in 5 years, they were in the same room. We have only Nabby's diary entry, written that evening, which describes her mother and father together with a brevity that contains volumes, that she had not seen her mother so happy in years. That was all. That she had not seen her mother so happy in years. They moved to Paris together, to a house in Auteuil just outside the city, where Jefferson was living nearby and the work of commercial treaty negotiation continued. For Abigail, Paris was a revelation and a slight shock. She found the city magnificent. She loved the opera, which she had never experienced before and which she attended 3 or 4 times a week with an enthusiasm that was entirely genuine. She admired the architecture. She found the food extraordinary. She also found the moral culture alarming, or at least significantly different from anything her New England sensibility had prepared her for. She met Thomas Jefferson in Paris and liked him immediately. They had a warmth between them that was evident in their correspondence from this period, a mutual appreciation between two very intelligent people who were both trying to understand each other and the extraordinary world they were all creating together. Jefferson admired Abigail with a directness that was its own tribute. He recognized in her something he respected, genuine intelligence combined with moral seriousness. But Paris was a temporary home. In 1785, John Adams was appointed as the first American minister to the court of St. James's, the first American ambassador to Britain. Which meant London. They moved to a house on Grosvenor Square, a fine address that announced their diplomatic status without being ostentatious, which was important because the budget provided by Congress for the legation was, as Abigail noted with brisk precision in several letters home, wholly inadequate for the entertainment required of a representative to the most powerful court in the world. The London years were complicated. Britain had not entirely accepted the reality of American independence in any emotional sense. There was a coolness, sometimes a hostility, in the official response to the American mission. John Adams was received at court by King George III with a formality that was courteous but not warm. The king reportedly told him that he was aware his appointment was a mark of esteem from his country, and John replied with some of the most careful and diplomatically precise language of his career. It was a meeting between a man and the king his country had just separated from, and both of them knew it, and both of them managed it with a professional grace that did not entirely conceal its fundamental awkwardness. She wrote home about London with the same vivid particularity she brought to everything. She wrote about the theater. She wrote about the paintings she saw. She wrote about the fog, the famous London fog, that came off the Thames and turned the streets into a soft grey mystery, muffling the sounds of the city and giving everything the quality of something seen through gauze. She wrote about the English obsession with class and the way it shaped every social interaction with an invisible but rigid structure that was almost the precise inverse of what she believed Americans were trying to build. Part 9: The Road to Power. They came home in 1788. The treaty negotiations were complete. The diplomatic missions had served their purposes. John Adams had been away from America, with very brief interruptions, for nearly a decade. He was 53 years old. His hair was graying. His health was less certain than it had been. He had put on weight during the Paris and London years, the inevitable consequence of diplomatic entertainment and less physical activity than the farm had always imposed. He was, by his own description, tired in a way that went deeper than sleep could reach. But the world was not finished with him. The United States of America was in the process of constituting itself. The new Constitution, drafted in Philadelphia in 1787, had been ratified and was going into effect. The first presidential election was being organized. George Washington would be president, there was no question of that, no contest for it. But the vice presidency was an open matter. And John Adams, after his years of service in Congress and in the diplomatic missions of the Revolution, was the most obvious choice. He was elected as the first vice president of the United States. He took office in 1789 and served 2 terms under Washington, 8 years in which his role was constitutionally limited. The Senate needed a presiding officer and the vice president was that officer, but in which he was also, as the man who would most obviously succeed Washington, always in a state of political preparation. Those 8 years were years of presence. He was home. The farm at Braintree, which they were expanding and improving, was his anchor. He and Abigail were together for more of this period than they had been since the early years of their marriage. The letters, for once, were not their primary mode of communication. They talked. They walked in the orchard. They read in the same room in the evenings. But public service brought its own separations. When Congress was in session, John had to be in New York, the first capital, and then Philadelphia. Abigail did not always come. Her health was uncertain in these years. She had recurring fevers and other ailments that made travel difficult and made the long seasons in drafty official residences less appealing than the farm. They wrote again, though less desperately than during the great separations of the Revolutionary years. The letters were shorter, more domestic, the letters of a settled couple rather than 2 people trying to hold each other together across an ocean. John Adams was a Federalist, broadly speaking, though he was never entirely comfortable with the label. He believed in strong central government. He believed in the rule of law. He believed that human nature required institutional checks to prevent the abuse of power. He was skeptical of pure democracy, which he thought tended toward mob rule, and equally skeptical of pure aristocracy, which tended toward tyranny. He had written at length, in his defense of the constitutions of the United States and in other works, about what he called the science of government, the need to design political institutions that would function well not just when governed by the virtuous but also when governed by the ambitious and the self-interested, which was most of the time. These views made him enemies. Thomas Jefferson, his friend from the Paris years, was moving in a different direction politically, toward a more optimistic view of popular democracy and a more suspicious view of central power. The friendship would survive the political divergence, barely, and at great cost, and only after many years and much bitterness. Abigail watched all of this with the sharp-eyed attention she always brought to public life. Her political views were, if anything, more Federalist than her husband's. She had less patience than he did with what she regarded as political demagoguery, less sympathy for what she saw as the excesses of the Democratic-Republican press, which attacked John Adams with a ferocity that she found both personally hurtful and politically dishonest. She wrote her opinions in letters home and in letters to friends and family with the same directness she had always shown. She was not diplomatic. She was honest. In 1796, Washington announced he would not seek a third term. The first genuinely contested presidential election was coming. John Adams ran. Thomas Jefferson ran. The result was one of the strangest outcomes in American electoral history. Adams won with 71 electoral votes to Jefferson's 68, which under the original constitutional rules made Adams president and Jefferson vice president. The two men, now representing opposing political visions, would have to govern together. It was an arrangement that satisfied neither of them and worked for neither of them and lasted through a presidency that was, from the beginning, shaped by the particular difficulty of its circumstances. Abigail wrote about the election with a mixture of pride and dread that her letters make no effort to conceal. She was proud of him. She believed in his qualifications. She also knew, with absolute clarity, what the presidency would cost. More absence. More separation. More of the exhausting and thankless work of public service. She was 52 years old and her health was not good. The prospect of the next 4 years was one she approached with resolution rather than enthusiasm. He was inaugurated on March 4, 1797. George Washington was there. Thomas Jefferson was there. And somewhere in the crowd, wearing her best dress and feeling, she later wrote, a complex mixture of emotions she struggled to name, was Abigail Adams. Part 10, The President and the Storm. The presidency of John Adams lasted 4 years and left marks on him that never entirely healed. It was not a happy presidency. It was a serious one. It was, in many respects, a courageous one. But it was not happy. And the letters from these years carry a different quality than the letters from the Revolutionary period: less hope, more endurance, the correspondence of two people who are holding the line against forces they cannot entirely control. The great crisis of the Adams presidency was the quasi-war with France. The French government, frustrated by what it regarded as American pro-British neutrality and outraged by the Jay Treaty with Britain, had begun seizing American merchant ships. The situation was deteriorating rapidly. War sentiment in Congress was running high. The Federalists, led by Alexander Hamilton, wanted a full declaration of war against France. Adams sent commissioners to Paris to negotiate. The French foreign minister, Talleyrand, instructed his agents to demand a bribe before negotiations could begin. When Adams reported this to Congress, replacing the agents' names with the letters X, Y, and Z, the American public erupted. XYZ became a rallying cry. Millions for defense but not 1 cent for tribute. Adams responded by building up the Navy and authorizing naval combat against French ships, which became the undeclared Quasi-War of 1798 to 1800. He did not, despite enormous pressure from the Hamiltonian wing of his own party, ask for a formal declaration of war. He believed a full war with France would be disastrous. He believed the naval conflict was enough to protect American interests while keeping the door open for negotiation. He was right. He achieved a negotiated settlement with France in the Convention of 1800. He ended the Quasi-War without a formal conflict. He protected the peace. And it destroyed his presidency. Hamilton and the High Federalists regarded Adams's peace overture to France as a betrayal. Hamilton wrote a vicious pamphlet attacking Adams's character and fitness for office that was meant to be circulated privately but became public, poisoning the well of Federalist support. The Democratic Republicans attacked Adams from the other direction, claiming he was a warmonger, an aristocrat, a man who wanted to create an American monarchy. Adams's relationship with the Alien and Sedition Acts is complicated. He never privately endorsed the Sedition Act with much enthusiasm. He did not initiate the prosecutions, though his administration carried them out. He believed the acts were constitutional. He later expressed regret that they had passed. In the context of a genuine foreign policy crisis, they are understandable. In the context of the principles of free expression that the revolution had been fought to establish, they are deeply troubling. Both things are true. The election of 1800 was one of the most consequential and chaotic in American history. Adams ran against Jefferson again. Aaron Burr was also in the race. The campaign was brutal. Adams was attacked from within his own party by Hamilton and from outside it by the Democratic Republicans. He campaigned as he always governed, by doing what he thought was right and trusting that it would eventually be recognized as such. It was not a very effective campaign strategy. He lost. Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr tied in the Electoral College, which threw the decision to the House of Representatives, which eventually chose Jefferson. Adams, the sitting president, found out he had lost the election while he was still in the new capital city of Washington, in the still unfinished White House, in the damp and somewhat dismal surroundings of a building that had been rushed to partial completion and whose rooms smelled of fresh plaster and wood shavings and the particular cold of an unheated space in November. He had written to Abigail about the city with characteristic honesty when he first arrived. The roads were bad, the location was swampy. The city as designed by Pierre-Charles L'Enfant was magnificent on paper but barely existed in reality. He asked her to come and join him. She came in the fall of 1800, arriving in the President's house, as it was then called, and immediately set about making it habitable. She hung the wet laundry in the East Room, which was the only warm enough space in the house, and continued managing the household of a presidency with her usual pragmatic efficiency, even as she knew the presidency was ending. Abigail was already home. She had left Washington in February, her health again uncertain, and had returned to Quincy, where she was waiting for him. he came home to the farm, to the apple trees and the smell of the sea, to the woman who had been waiting for him, in one sense or another, for 30 years. Part 11, Quincy, Old Age, and the Letter That Survived Everything. The house at Quincy, which the Adamses called Peacefield, stands at the end of a long driveway lined with old trees. Pause. It is a larger house than the Saltbox where John was born, expanded and improved over the years from the money Abigail made from her careful trading and the accumulated savings of a long career in public service. There is a parlor with good proportions and a library where the shelves are full of the books that John Adams had been acquiring across a lifetime of reading. There is a garden that Abigail tended with the same thorough attention she brought to everything, and fields beyond the garden where the grass in summer moved in long waves when the wind came off the harbor. It was here that they settled into old age together. After the extraordinary decades of separation, after the years of letters crossing the Atlantic and the months of waiting for news and the long-sustained effort of keeping a marriage and a partnership alive across every kind of distance, they were at last simply together. In the same house. In the same rooms. Able to speak to each other directly, without the mediation of ink and parchment, without the weeks-long delay between question and answer. John Adams was 65 when he came home. He would live to 90. He had, in other words, a quarter-century of ordinary life still ahead of him, and he spent that quarter-century in a kind of sustained and productive retirement that was unusual for the age. He read voraciously. He annotated his books with the same dense handwriting he had always used, arguing in the margins with authors who had been dead for centuries as if the conversation were still live. He wrote long letters to friends and former colleagues. He wrote his memoirs and reflections. He gardened. He walked. And he began, slowly and with considerable stubbornness on both sides, the process of reconciling with Thomas Jefferson. The reconciliation was brokered by their mutual friend Benjamin Rush, a Philadelphia physician who had known both men for decades and who believed that the sight of two of the greatest figures of the revolutionary generation dying estranged from each other would be a tragedy for the country and a waste of two brilliant minds. He wrote to Adams. He wrote to Jefferson. He nudged and suggested, and eventually, in 1812, John Adams picked up his pen and wrote to Thomas Jefferson at Monticello. What followed was one of the great correspondences in American history. Over the next 14 years, until their deaths, Adams and Jefferson exchanged 158 letters. The letters range across everything: philosophy, history, religion, education, the nature of aristocracy, the French Revolution, the future of the republic they had helped create, what they had believed and why. They are the letters of two very old men who have lived through the most consequential events of their age and are now, from the distance of time and retirement, trying to understand what it all meant. Abigail was part of this reconciliation, tentatively and with some reservation. She had not forgotten or entirely forgiven some of what had passed between their families during the political wars of the 1790s. A particular episode, in which Jefferson had allowed one of his supporters to use a private letter of Abigail's for political purposes, had left a wound that did not fully close. She and Jefferson exchanged letters briefly in 1804 after the death of her daughter Nabby's close friend, and the correspondence was warm, but it did not fully restore what had been lost. Nabby. Abigail Jr. The daughter who had stood beside her mother and watched the world remake itself, who had married William Smith with the kind of hope that daughters carry into marriages and had found the marriage less than she had hoped for, whose husband's business failures and absences had created a private sadness that the family correspondence circles around carefully. Nabby was diagnosed with breast cancer in 1811. She underwent surgery in 1812, in an era when surgery was performed without anesthesia and infection was as great a danger as the disease itself. She recovered briefly and then did not recover. She died in 1813, at the age of 48, in the room at Quincy where she had been born. Abigail bore this loss with the same composed and genuine grief she had brought to every loss of her life. She wrote about it to friends and family with the quiet precision of someone who has been acquainted with death for a very long time and has developed, not indifference, but a kind of clear-eyed acceptance that knows sorrow and does not flinch from it. She wrote that she was resigned to the will of God. She wrote that she missed her daughter every day. She wrote that old age was partly a matter of learning to carry what you carry. The house at Quincy was quieter after that. The rhythms of very old age settled over it. John's eyesight was failing. His hands trembled sometimes when he wrote, the strong reliable hands that had produced thousands of pages of argument and letter across 7 decades of intellectual life. Abigail managed the household still, though with more help than she had ever allowed herself in younger years. They sat together in the evenings in the way that people do when they have been together long enough that silence is comfortable, when the presence itself is the conversation. Abigail Adams died on October 28, 1818. She was 73 years old. She had been ill for several weeks with typhoid fever, and she had known, with the characteristic clear-sightedness that had always distinguished her, that she was not going to recover. She died at home, at Quincy, in the bedroom of the house she had managed for most of her adult life. John was with her. He was 82 years old. He had loved her for 55 years. He had written her more than 1,000 letters. He had depended on her in every way that a person can depend on another person, for practical management of their joint life, for intellectual companionship, for emotional honesty, for the specific irreplaceable comfort of being known completely by someone who chooses to stay. He wrote to Thomas Jefferson after her death with a brevity that contains everything. He wrote, "I wish I could lay down beside her and die too." That sentence. From a man who had argued the rights of nations before the courts of Europe. From a man who had sat in the rooms where the founding documents of the United States were drafted and debated. From a man whose letters fill volumes and whose ideas shaped centuries. That sentence. He wrote to Jefferson. He read. He dictated to his grandchildren when his hands made writing too difficult. He continued to think about history and about the nation's future with the stubborn intellectual energy that had never left him. And he waited, not with impatience but with the quiet readiness of someone who has made peace with what is coming. Jefferson wrote back from Monticello across those 8 years, and the letters remained extraordinary. They discussed what would happen to the Republic. They discussed slavery, that unresolved and monstrous contradiction at the heart of the American project, with a candor and a shared anxiety that neither of them had permitted themselves in their years of active political life. Adams had always been more willing to name the problem directly. Jefferson's relationship with the subject was complicated by his own situation in ways that the letters never quite fully address, but the anxiety is there in both of them, the fear that this thing they had built, this experiment in liberty, was carrying within it the seeds of its own destruction. Adams wrote in one of his late letters to Jefferson, "I have seen with inward grief the bloody scourge of party spirit, but I cannot forsake the hope that the principles laid down in our founding documents will ultimately prevail." He was a man of hope. A difficult, argumentative, often exasperating, occasionally wrong, profoundly principled man of hope. and that hope sustained him through the long last years without Abigail, through the quiet evenings at Quincy, through the fading of sight and strength, through the accumulation of loss that very long life inevitably brings. Part 12, the 50th year and what the letters became. It comes in at a long angle in the late afternoon, warm and golden and specific, the kind of light that makes familiar things look momentarily strange and beautiful, that turns an ordinary garden into something you want to stand still in and simply observe. At Quincy, in the summer of 1826, that light fell through the windows of the old house on a man who was 90 years old and dying. John Adams had been failing through the spring. His body was exhausted in the way that 90-year-old bodies are, with the particular gentle failure of a mechanism that has run for too long and is finally, at last, slowing to a stop. He was confined to his chair, then to his bed. He could speak, though not always clearly. He could think, though the thoughts came more slowly now. July 4, 1826 was the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. The 50th year of the nation that John Adams had helped create in that hot room in Philadelphia in the summer of 1776. It was celebrated across the country with the bells and bonfires that John had predicted in his letter to Abigail 50 years earlier, written on July 3 when the ink was barely dry on the resolution and he was already imagining how it would be remembered. On that day, in Monticello, Virginia, Thomas Jefferson died. The coincidence struck the nation with the force of a story that was too perfect to be true and yet was true. Two of the last surviving founders. Two men who had been allies and friends and enemies in correspondence across 50 years of the most consequential American history. Dead on the same day. Dead on the 50th anniversary of the thing they had both made possible. It seemed to many people at the time, and seems to many people still, like a statement of some kind, though about what exactly, whether providence, or pattern, or simply the magnificent indifference of coincidence, no one has ever been able to say definitively. John Adams's reported last words were, "Thomas Jefferson survives." He was wrong, by a few hours. Jefferson had died that morning at Monticello. But Adams did not know this. He died believing that his great friend and great adversary was still alive, still writing letters at the desk in the study at Monticello, still thinking about the republic they had both spent their lives building. It is a strange and moving last thought. Not of Abigail, who had been gone for 8 years. Not of his children or his grandchildren. His last articulate thought was of Jefferson. Of the great argument they had conducted across decades, the argument about what America was and what it should be, the argument that was inseparable from his friendship with Jefferson and from the whole long project of his political life. He was buried next to Abigail in a crypt at what is now the United First Parish Church in Quincy. They lie there still. Two people who had written each other more than 1,000 letters across 50 years of extraordinary life, who had conducted the most sustained and intimate epistolary love affair in American history, who had loved each other through the Revolution and the diplomacy and the politics and the grief and the very ordinary dailiness of long marriage. The letters survived. This is perhaps the most important fact about them. They were not destroyed, as so many private letters of the period were. They were kept, first by the family, then by institutions, and eventually they were published, in various editions across the 19th and 20th centuries, until the full collection became available to anyone who wanted to read it. And people did want to read it. They do want to read it. Because the letters are not historical artifacts in the dry sense, documents that tell you what happened and why. They are something more alive than that. They are a record of two people being human together across the longest and most extraordinary chapter in American history. They are a record of intelligence and love and political passion and ordinary domesticity and grief and hope and the specific daily texture of two lives that happen to intersect with the birth of a nation. Her letter about remembering the ladies has been quoted in every major study of women's history in America. It has been taught in schools and referenced in Supreme Court arguments and cited in feminist scholarship for well over a century. It is one of the most quoted letters in American history, and it is quoted because it says something that was genuinely remarkable for its time and remains genuinely relevant in ways that the world is still working out. But the letters are more than any single memorable passage. They are more than any selected quotation can convey. They are the whole sustained conversation, the 30 years of correspondence that begins with a young lawyer teasing a minister's daughter about the way she sits and ends with an old man saying he wishes he could lie down beside her and die. The breadth of that arc. From Diana and Lysander to two old people in a New England farmhouse, from political playfulness to genuine historical reckoning. What happened in between that arc is the American Revolution and the founding of a republic and the raising of children and the management of a farm and 5 years on either side of an ocean and a presidency and the loss of grandeur and the return to quiet and the daily irreducible fact of loving someone. The letters of John and Abigail Adams are what remains when the history is distilled down to its human core. They are what is left when you strip away the dates and the treaties and the elections and the appointments and ask simply, what were these people to each other? What did they feel? How did they hold on? And the answer, in their own words, is extraordinary. They held on through language. They held on by writing. They held on by telling each other the truth, even the difficult truths, even the truths that were inconvenient or frightening or politically unmanageable. They held on by being, to each other, completely known. There is a famous line from one of John's letters to Abigail, written during the years when he was in Congress and she was at Braintree and the world was making its enormous demands on both of them. He wrote, "I must study politics and war, that our sons may have liberty to study mathematics and philosophy. Our sons ought to study mathematics and philosophy, geography, natural history and naval architecture, navigation, commerce, and agriculture in order to give their children a right to study painting, poetry, music, architecture, statuary, tapestry, and porcelain." That letter has been quoted for 200 years as a statement about the necessity of sacrifice in the service of future generations. And it is that. But it is also something else. It is a love letter. It is a man telling the woman he loves that the reason he is doing what he is doing, the reason he is studying politics and war instead of coming home, is so that the people who come after them can have something better. It is a letter about hope. It is a letter about the future. And it is addressed to Abigail. Everything was addressed to Abigail, in the end. The hope and the fear and the political argument and the homesickness and the grief. She was the person to whom all of it was sent. She was the reader he was always writing for, even when he was writing for posterity, because she was the person whose judgment he trusted most completely, whose intelligence he respected most fully, and whose presence, across whatever distance separated them, was the organizing center of his entire interior life. John Quincy Adams, their son, who had stood on Penn's Hill with his mother at the age of 7 and watched the Battle of Bunker Hill through the smoke, became the 6th President of the United States in 1825, the year before his father died. John Adams knew this. He lived to see it. He lived to see his son succeed where he himself had succeeded, reaching the highest office the Republic offered. He wrote about it with the particular mixture of pride and characteristic self-awareness that marked everything he wrote about himself and his family, that he hoped his son would do better than he had done, that the work was never finished, that each generation inherited the responsibility of keeping alive what the previous one had built. The letters were his way of passing that on too. Not just the political philosophy, not just the historical record, but the example of how to be a person in relationship with another person across the enormous demands of a public life. How to stay honest. How to stay close. How to love someone across distance without losing the person you love to the distance. There are mornings in Quincy when the light comes through the windows of the old house and falls on the floor in long warm rectangles, and the sound of the wind in the apple trees is the same sound it has always been, and the harbor is visible in the distance, and you can almost believe that nothing has entirely gone. That the letter is still being written. That the quill is still scratching across the page in the study above the garden. That somewhere across the water, someone is waiting to receive it. The waiting ends. The letter arrives. It always does, eventually. Closing meditation. Let yourself settle, now. Let whatever remains of the day fall away from you like water, quietly, without effort. The farmhouse at Quincy is quiet now. The apple trees are still. The harbor beyond the low hill reflects a sky that is slowly deepening from deep blue toward black, and the first stars are appearing, one by one, in the way they always have, the way they appeared over the Atlantic when John Adams was seasick and frightened and writing in his diary because writing was how he kept hold of himself. Somewhere in the archive, the letters still exist. Thousands of pages. Abigail's handwriting and John's handwriting, sometimes the same page, as if even the paper could not keep them entirely separate. The words are still there, patient and legible and alive in the way that language is always alive when the person who wrote it meant every word. You do not need to hold any of it. You do not need to remember any particular date or name or treaty. What matters, if anything matters as you drift toward sleep, is only the simplest thing, that two people loved each other across an extraordinary life, and they wrote it all down, and it survived, and we can still read it. Let that be enough. Let that be more than enough. The candle gutters. The ink dries on the page. Outside, the apple trees move in the evening wind off the harbor, and the stars come out one by one over Quincy, over the old house, over everything that time has kept and everything that time has taken. Sleep well. Rest now. If you're still awake, that's okay. Just close your eyes and let the story carry you. Subscribe to History for Sleep for a new story every week. Sweet dreams.